We're here in the stores of Paisley Museum, in among the looms, various textile machinery, yarns, fabrics, and of course the shawls. These are all part of the material legacy of the tradition of weaving and textile production in Paisley. For a period of about 200 years, from 1750 until 1950, Paisley was a world leader in several branches of the textile trade. In 1805, the weaving of imitation Indian shawls was introduced. This, as the name implies, was an attempt to imitate the cashmere shawl of India. It was part of a European attempt to reproduce this fashionable but very rare and very expensive fabric. The cashmere shawl was woven on very simple looms, where the weavers, the Kashmiri weavers, put in the weft, all the decorative weft, by hand. So using this technique, it could take 3 weavers, 2 weavers, or maybe 3 weavers sitting on the one loom, maybe a year or even 18 months to weave a single shawl. The goal of the European manufacturers was to produce similar shawls, but using European technology and manufacturing expertise. There was very few places in Europe undertook this because to match the dexterity of the human hand with technology demanded a high level of technology and a high level of skill as well. And Paisley had already nurtured these skills and developed these skills in the weaving of the silk gauze and the muslin, the figured muslin. So they had a pool of very highly skilled weavers, and they were able to take on the challenge of trying to weave these imitation Indian shawls. And during this period, the shawl went through many evolutionary changes in style and format and all that, and it eventually developed its own characteristics, very different from the original cashmere prototype. So it became known as the Paisley shawl rather than the imitation Indian shawl. There's quite a lot of literature on the shawl, beginning in maybe in the 1850s and 40s with the newly emerging Victorian journalism. None of them go into any depth into the technology of shawl weaving as to how it was woven. As a trained weaver myself and a textile designer, and as a curator of textiles in Paisley Museum, I've tried to rectify this problem by investigating how the shawls were woven, the various technologies used, the development of the technology and all that. So my presentation is going to try and explain as well as possible all the various stages of shawl production in the production of a Paisley shawl. This is one of our many pattern books we have here in Paisley Museum, and it contains a whole series of what they call sketches for Paisley shawls, for borders, for various, the runner boards or the linked, the cross borders, and it shows the design level of the local pattern drawers in Paisley. These would have been produced by a specialist, a pattern drawer, who spent all of his time actually drawing out these patterns for shawls. And if we look through it, we can see the method of working, where they do it out in pencil and then they begin painting it in. And so this is I would say the Paisley shawl is probably the greatest or the most significant contribution of Paisley to world culture in the design and production of the Paisley shawls. We have maybe 100 pattern books, but these are, and sample books, but these represent only a very small section of what was produced in Paisley throughout the 19th century. Here we have examples of some shawls that more than likely were woven in Paisley. This is very typical of the early attempts at weaving Paisley shawls. It's from maybe the late 1820s. Here we have another example, and we can see that the shawl is developing in style and all this. This is Harlequin style because of the blocks of colour encasing the motifs. We can see the back of these shawls, which are quite different than the front, and this is because in the European version, and including the Paisley version of the Paisley Shawl, the weft was passed across and only went into the surface of the cloth where it was needed. So at the end, when the weaver took the shawl off the loom, it would be covered in heavy weft, and this all had to be sheared off in the finishing process. So in the back of the Paisley shawls, you'll see it's the result of this shearing, where once there was many threads across this, they're all sheared off, giving it a fuzzy back. The cutting off of the back of the loose wefts was obviously very wasteful, so there was many attempts to try and solve this problem, and it was eventually solved towards the end of the trade when they produced what was known as a reversible shawl. So this shawl is good on both sides. There's a pattern on both sides. It doesn't have to be clipped. So this saved a lot of money and materials, in that the shawl, when worn, didn't have to be folded over to hide the back of it. Also, it didn't need to be clipped, which saved time, and also there was no wastage in the weft, which would be cut off and discarded. However, it came towards the end of the trade, and it's really the last of the various types of Paisley shawls produced in Paisley.